The saloon went dead quiet the moment old Martha Halloway limped through the swinging doors, hair tangled like storm-blown sage, muttering to herself as cowhands mocked her sanity. Folks called her Crazy Martha, said she slept under bridges and talked to ghosts. But when a drunk rancher grabbed her arm, young cowboy Eli Mercer stepped between them, and hovering over his holster, voice steady, "Leave the lady be." The room laughed, until she lifted her chin, eye sharp as polished steel, and whispered the name that once shook the frontier, "I am Martha Colt." Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The piano player stopped first, his fingers freezing over the keys as the cruelty in the corner of the Dusty Spur Saloon grew loud enough to curdle the smoke-thick air. Eli Mercer stared into his whiskey glass, the amber liquid trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from the vibration of boots stomping on the floorboards behind him. He was a man who had spent a decade burying his past beneath hard labor and silence, a ranch hand who spoke only when necessary and drew his gun even less often. Yet tonight the shadows were stretching long and violent. In the center of the jeering circle crouched the woman the town called Crazy Martha, a heap of rags and matted gray hair that smelled of river mud and old sorrow. A young cattle drover, drunk on cheap courage, kicked the leg of her chair, sending her sprawling onto the sawdust, and the room erupted in a jagged, ugly laughter that tore through Eli's restraint like barbed wire. He did not stand quickly, for sudden movements spooked cattle and men alike, but when he rose, the shifting of his weight made the floorboards groan in protest. He walked through the crowd like the prow of a ship cutting through ice, the laughter dying in throats as his shadow fell over the drover. Eli merely said that was enough, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chest, not a threat but a promise of violence he desperately wished to avoid. The drover sneered, spitting near the woman's boot, claiming she was nothing but a beggar witch who scared the horses and brought bad luck to the harvest. The woman on the floor slowly pushed herself up, and as she rose, the trembling in her hands ceased, replaced by a sudden, terrifying stillness that silenced even the wind rattling the window panes. She wiped a streak of dirt from her cheek, revealing skin that had once known the softness of silk, and looked the drover in the eye with a clarity that stopped his heart. She told them to look at her, not at the rags, but at the woman, and when she spoke her name, it was not a plea but a declaration of war. She said she was Martha Colt. The name sucked the air out of the room, for every man there knew the legend of the Colt family, the blood feud that had scorched the earth 20 years ago, leaving nothing but ashes and ghosts where a dynasty once stood. They were all supposed to be dead, buried in unmarked graves along the creek, yet here stood the heir, resurrected in filth and carrying the weight of 1,000 nightmares. The drover stepped back, pale as milk, as if he had seen a spirit rise from hell to demand a reckoning. Eli looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not madness, but a ferocious, burning intelligence that had survived the unthinkable. He placed a gentle hand on her elbow, guiding her toward the door as the patrons stood frozen, trapped in the amber of their own shock. As they stepped into the cool night air, the saloon doors swinging shut behind them, Eli felt the heavy weight of destiny settling onto his shoulders, knowing that by walking out that door with her, he had just walked away from his peace forever, trading the quiet life for a ghost story that was dangerously, violently alive. The fire began as a reluctant spark, a single fragile point of light fighting against the suffocating weight of a moonless prairie night, before Eli Mercer coaxed it into a small, shivering flame that licked hungrily at the dry mesquite branches he had gathered from the riverbank. The sound of the water was a constant, low-throated murmur in the darkness, a rhythmic thrashing against the mud that sounded less like a river and more like the earth itself breathing in its sleep, heavy and restless. Eli worked with the practiced, silent economy of a man who had spent half his life sleeping under the stars, his movements deliberate and slow, not because he was tired, but because silence was the only armor he had left. He set the blackened tin coffee pot on a flat rock near the heat, the water inside already beginning to hiss, and the smell of burned beans and chicory rose up to battle the stench of wet river clay and the lingering, copper tang of the violence they had left behind in the saloon. Martha sat across from him, a shapeless silhouette wrapped in the oversized wool blanket he had pulled from his saddlebag, her knees drawn up to her chest as if she were trying to make herself small enough to disappear entirely. She watched the fire with an intensity that was unsettling, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames so clearly that it looked as though her soul was burning from the inside out. Eli poured the coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the cold air, and extended the cup toward her, his hand hovering in the space between them. A peace offering, a question, a bridge across the chasm of 20 years of mystery. She took it without looking at him, her fingers gnarled and stained with the grime of her exile, trembling so violently that the coffee sloshed over the rim, scalding her skin. Yet she did not flinch, did not pull away, did not make a sound. It was as if the pain of the heat was nothing compared to the cold that had settled in her bones. She brought the cup to her lips, blowing the steam away, and when she finally spoke, her voice was a dry, cracking sound, like dead leaves being crushed under a boot heel. She didn't say thank you. She spoke of ash. She spoke of the way a house sounds when the support beams give way to fire, a groaning, screaming surrender that she still heard every time she closed her eyes. Eli sat back on his heels, the leather of his chaps creaking softly, and listened as the woman who was supposed to be a ghost began to bleed her memories into the night. Her words were fragmented, jagged shards of a broken mirror that refused to reflect a whole image, offering only glimpses of a nightmare that had never ended. She whispered about broken treaties, pieces of paper signed by men in suits who smiled while they sharpened their knives, promises that were worth less than the ink used to write them. She spoke of a child, a boy whose name she could not bring herself to say, buried not in a churchyard with a cross and a prayer, but in the rush of this very river, his resting place marked only by a smooth gray stone that the water would eventually wash away, just as it had washed away her life. Eli watched her, his own coffee forgotten in his hand, feeling a cold dread coil in his stomach. He knew about the Colt massacre. Everyone did, but hearing it from the lips of the survivor was like touching a live wire. It hummed with a terrifying, raw energy. He asked her, his voice low and rough, why she had run, why she had let the world believe she was dead for 2 decades while the weeds grew over her family's graves. Martha didn't answer immediately. She stared into the heart of the fire, her face a mask of tragic resolve, the flickering light casting deep, skeletal shadows into the hollows of her cheeks. She murmured that running was not a choice, but a necessity, a way to keep the last spark of the Colt bloodline from being snuffed out by the gale force of greed that had swept through the valley. She talked about nights spent shivering in caves, about eating roots and stealing from porch steps, about shutting her identity layer by layer until she was nothing but a whisper in the wind, a creature of survival and instinct. But then, the trembling in her hands stopped. A sudden, steel spine rigidity took over her posture, and she lowered the cup, looking across the flames at Eli with eyes that were no longer cloudy with age, but sharp, piercing, and dangerously lucid. She said she wasn't done yet. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, sinking into the silence like stones dropped into a deep well. She didn't explain what that meant. She didn't detail a plan or a map or a list of names, but the implication was a sledgehammer to the chest. She hadn't returned to die. She had returned to finish something that had started in blood and would likely end in it. Eli looked away, staring out into the impenetrable blackness beyond the firelight, where the coyotes were beginning to yip and howl at the rising moon. He felt the familiar, sickening pull of a moral riptide. He was a man who just wanted to earn his wage, ride his fences, and keep his head down. A man who knew that getting involved in the affairs of ghosts and land barons was a quick way to end up in a pine box. Every instinct he had honed over years of survival screamed at him to mount his horse, leave her the blanket and the coffee, and ride until this river was a distant memory. He could vanish too. It was easy to vanish in the West. But then he looked back at her, this broken, ferocious woman clutching a tin cup as if it were a scepter, a queen of ruins sitting on a throne of dirt. He saw the scars on her hands, the grief etched into the lines around her mouth, and he felt a heavy anchor drop in his chest, tethering him to her fate. He realized with a thinking heart that he couldn't leave her. Not here. Not like this. She was a storm waiting to break, and he was the only shelter she had, even if being her shelter meant he would be torn apart by the wind she was summoning. He poked the fire, sending a shower of orange sparks swirling up into the vast, indifferent sky, and settled his back against a log, tipping his hat low over his eyes. He told her to sleep, that he would watch the dark, but as he listened to her breathing slow into a fitful, haunted rhythm, Eli Mercer knew that sleep would not come easily for him tonight, for the darkness was no longer just around them. It was closing in, and he had just volunteered to stand in its way. Dawn broke over the township not with the promise of a new day, but with the sickly, yellow pallor of an old bruise, the sun dragging itself reluctantly over the jagged spine of the eastern ridge as if it were afraid to illuminate the secrets that had been unearthed in the darkness of the previous night. The silence that usually draped over the town in the gray hours before commerce began was absent, replaced by a frantic, hushed vibration that hummed through the timber walls of the boarding house and rattled the glass of the storefronts, a frequency of anxiety that set the stray dogs to barking at nothing but the air itself. News in this hard, unforgiving territory traveled faster than the telegraph wire could ever carry, passing from lip to ear with the speed of a prairie fire consuming dry grass. And by the time the first pot of coffee had boiled over on the cast-iron stoves of the waking families, the name Martha Colt was on every tongue, tasted with a mixture of disbelief, terror, and a dark, morbid curiosity. It was no longer the rambling of a madwoman in a saloon. It was a resurrection story that defied the natural order of the frontier, a tale of a ghost walking out of the history books to demand a reckoning that no one was prepared to pay. The town, which had spent 20 years burying the memory of the Colt massacre under layers of commerce and expansion, suddenly found itself haunted, the dust of the street seeming to churn with the restless spirits of a war they had all pretended was finished. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist but doing nothing to dissolve the tension, the riders began to arrive, drifting in from the surrounding scrublands and the distant, lonely homesteads like leaves blown by an ill wind. These were not the young, brash cowboys who frequented the Dusty Spur on Saturday nights, but men carved from dried river mud and old saddle leather, their faces mapped with the deep, chaotic ravines of age and violence. They were the veterans of the Colt War, the survivors of the brutal land feud that had torn the county apart 2 decades prior, men who carried pieces of lead in their bodies and heavier weights in their souls. They rode animals that looked as tired and grim as they did, their tack worn smooth and dark with years of sweat, and they moved with the heavy, deliberate gravity of soldiers returning to a battlefield they had prayed never to see again. Some rode with a hand hovering near their holsters, their eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways with the twitchy paranoia of men who expected an ambush, driven by a thirst for vengeance that had curdled into a poisonous obsession over the long, lonely years. Others rode with their heads bowed, seeking not blood but closure, looking for a way to finally lay down the burden of guilt that had bent their spines, hoping that if Martha Colt was alive, perhaps their own sins could be forgiven. They tethered their horses along the main rail, a silent, grim-faced cavalcade that transformed the bustling street into a somber wake, their presence a physical reminder that the past was never truly dead, only waiting for the right moment to reload. Eli Mercer, having left Martha hidden in the thicket by the river to secure supplies, moved through this gathering storm with the collar of his coat turned up, trying to make himself invisible against the backdrop of weathered wood and peeling paint. But the town that had once ignored him now watched his every step with a predatory focus. He felt the eyes on him, heavy and accusing, peeling back his anonymity to reveal the target painted on his back. He was loading a sack of flour onto his saddle when the shadow of the law fell over him, long and stretching out across the dirt. Sheriff Miller stood on the boardwalk, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, his face a mask of weary resignation that barely concealed the sharp, flinty edge of his authority. The sheriff was a man who had kept the peace by knowing which battles to fight and which to ignore, but today he looked like a man who knew he was standing in the path of a landslide. He stepped down into the street, the jingle of his spurs sounding like a warning bell, and spoke in a voice that was low, gravelly, and stripped of all pleasantries. He told Eli that he didn't know what game he was playing, pulling a corpse out of the river mud and parading it through his town, but he needed to understand the stakes before the first shot was fired. He leaned in close enough for Eli to smell the stale tobacco and the fear on the man, and whispered that Colts bring blood. It was a statement of fact, as immutable as the laws of gravity. Wherever that family went, death followed like a faithful hound. and the sheriff warned Eli that if he stood with her, he would be swept away in the torrent just like everyone else who had ever tried to save them. Eli didn't answer, his jaw set in a line of granite, but as he walked away, he felt the truth of the sheriff's words settling into his bones. He made his way toward the livery, passing the open doors of the saloon where the morning crowd had already gathered, not to drink, but to conspire. The conversation inside died the instant his shadow crossed the threshold, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like a physical blow. He glanced inside and saw men he had worked with, men he had shared meals and fires with during the long cattle drives, looking at him as if he were a stranger, or worse, a traitor. The gossip had mutated overnight, twisting the narrative until Eli was no longer the good Samaritan who had helped a helpless woman, but a conspirator, an accomplice who had been hiding the cult there for years, plotting alongside her to dismantle the delicate peace they had built on stolen land. He heard the word accomplice hissed from the back of the room, followed by the sharp crack of a glass being slammed down on a table, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet. They didn't see a quiet ranch hand anymore. They saw a man who had aligned himself with chaos, a man who was threatening their property, their history, and their safety by digging up a grave they all wanted to stay closed. Eli tightened his grip on the reins of his horse, feeling the isolation wrap around him like a cold iron chain. He was no longer just a man doing a good deed. He was an enemy of the state of things, a pariah standing on the wrong side of a line that had been drawn in blood 20 years ago. He swung into the saddle, looking down at the town that had turned its back on him, and realized that by saving Martha, he had condemned himself. The rumors were not just words, they were the kindling for a fire that was about to consume them all, and as he turned his horse back toward the river, Eli knew that the time for talking was over. The ghosts were awake, the town was armed, and he was the only thing standing between the match and the powder keg. The afternoon sun beat down on the riverbank with a relentless, exposing glare, baking the mud into a cracked mosaic that mirrored the fractured history lying between Eli and the woman who sat before him. Martha had stopped pacing. She sat on a fallen cottonwood log, her hands clasped tightly around a small, leather-bound journal she had produced from the depths of her rags, the cover worn smooth by decades of nervous friction. She did not open it. She didn't need to, for the contents were etched into the scar tissue of her mind, but she held it like a holy relic, the only physical tether to a reality the world had decided to erase. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of the manic vibration that had defined crazy Martha, replaced by the hollow, resonant timbre of a matriarch reciting a eulogy for a dream that had been murdered in its crib. She told Eli that the town had it all wrong. The rumors of buried gold and hidden stashes of silver were lies spawned by small minds to explain a tragedy they couldn't comprehend. The cult legacy was never about wealth. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Eli as with a desperate, burning clarity, and revealed that the sprawling valley her family once held was never meant to be a cattle empire or a monument to vanity. It was designated to be a sanctuary. She used the word carefully, tasting it like communion wine. A refuge for the widows of the wars that had bled the country dry, a home for the orphans wandering the dust-choked roads with hollow bellies, a place where the broken could mend without the weight of a debt ledger hanging over their heads. The Colt family had drafted the charters, built the foundations of a school and a hospital, and fenced off the land not to keep people out, but to hold the cruelty of the world at bay. Eli listened, the rushing river fading into the background, as the true shape of the tragedy began to take form in the air between them. This was not a land dispute, it was the slaughter of a utopia. Martha's fingers whitened around the journal as she spoke the name that had poisoned the water for 20 years, Silas Greeley. The railroad baron had not seen a sanctuary. He had seen a gradient, a straight line of iron and steam that needed to cut through the heart of the Colt Valley to save his company 10 miles of track and $1 million in grading costs. He had offered money first, insulting sums that her father had thrown back in his face, and when the gold was refused, the iron arrived. Martha recounted the escalation not as a history lesson, but as a reliving of the trauma, her voice dropping to a whisper that forced Eli to lean in, pulling him into the nightmare. The Colts had resisted. They had stood on their porch with rifles in the law, believing that a deed and a righteous cause were enough to stop the march of industry. but they had underestimated the ruthlessness of a man who measured progress in severed ties and burned timber. The massacre hadn't started with a declaration of war. It started with the silence of a moonless night, broken by the thunder of hoofbeats that didn't belong to their own stock. Martha closed her eyes, and a single tear, clean and sharp as glass, cut a path through the dirt on her cheek. She described the smell of coal oil doused over the sanctuary frames, the roar of the flames that drowned out the screams of the horses, and the sudden, chaotic eruption of gunfire that turned the family home into a slaughterhouse. She had been hidden in the cellar, a terrified girl clutching a doll, listening to the heavy boots of Greeley's hired killers moving across the floorboards above her head, listening to her father beg not for his life, but for the children. Before the final, deafening shots silenced the pleas, the madness, she confessed, had been her only escape, a fugue state she wrapped around herself like a thick, gray blanket to hide from the reality that she was the last one left breathing. She had watched from the tree line as the fires burned down to embers, watched as Greeley's surveyors arrived the very next week to drive their stakes into the ash, marking the grave of her family's dream as the future site of a depot. For 20 years, she had wandered the periphery of her own life, a ghost haunting the edges of the empire built on her kin's bones, allowing the town to dismiss her as a lunatic because a lunatic was no threat to a railroad baron. But the madness was lifting now, burned away by a duty that had outlasted her grief. She opened a journal then, revealing pages brittle with age, covered in the handwriting of the dead, maps, charters, lists of names of the families they had promised to save. She ran a trembling finger over a line of ink, her voice gaining a steel edge that made the hair on Eli's arms stand up. She hadn't returned to mourn. She hadn't come back to beg for scraps or sympathy. She told Eli that the railroad had failed to properly file the annexation papers in the chaos of the massacre, a bureaucratic oversight buried under years of bribes and corruption, but one that she had never forgotten. The land, legally, was still hers. She had returned to claim what was left, not for herself, but to resurrect the sanctuary from the ashes, to fulfill the promise her father had died defending. Eli looked at the woman, really seeing her for the first time, not as a victim, but as a titan of endurance who had carried a burning coal in her chest for 2 decades without letting it consume her. He looked at the map, then out at the valley where the smoke of the distant train could be seen staining the horizon, and felt the ground shift beneath him. He wasn't just protecting an old woman from a lynch mob anymore. He was standing guard over a holy war between the soul of the frontier and the machine that sought to crush it. The stakes had just risen from life and death to something far more permanent, redemption. Martha snapped the book shut, the sound final and sharp, and looked at him with eyes that demanded a choice. She was ready to die for this. The question hanging in the hot, still air was whether Eli was ready to do the same. The silence that followed Martha's revelation was not a peace, but a vacuum. A suffocating void that sucked the air right out of Eli Mercer's lungs and left him gasping against the weight of a truth he had carried like a millstone in his gut for 15 years. He watched her hands, still clutching the leather-bound journal, those hands that had been broken and calloused by the very machine he had once helped to oil, and he felt a wave of nausea so potent it nearly doubled him over, a physical rejection of his own hypocrisy. He couldn't look at her, not really, to look at her now. With the holy fire of her mission burning in her eyes and the ghosts of her kin standing vigil around her, was to look into a mirror that reflected nothing but his own cowardice back at him. He stood up abruptly, the movement jarring in the stillness, and walked to the edge of the riverbank where the water was black and churning, the sound of the current masking the tremor in his voice as he finally spoke, not to her, but to the darkness that stretched out endlessly toward the horizon. He told her she shouldn't trust him, the words low and scraped from the bottom of his throat like rust. He told her that the man she saw, the quiet ranch hand with the gentle touch for spooked horses and the patience of a saint, was a lie, a costume stitched together from silence and hard labor to hide a rot underneath that time had failed to heal. He turned to face her then, the dying firelight catching the hard, weathered lines of his face, casting half of him in shadow, which was fitting, for he was a man divided down the center. He confessed that he knew Silas Greeley not by reputation, not by the fear he inspired in the townsfolk, but by payroll. Years ago, before the gray had settled in his beard and the limp had settled in his stride, Eli had ridden with the Greeley regulators, The elite circle of hired guns paid to clear the path for the tracks when the law was too slow or too soft to do the job. He saw Martha flinch, a small, sharp movement like a bird sensing the shadow of a hawk. But he didn't stop. He owed her the bloodletting of this secret, the surgical removal of the deception between them. He spoke of a winter day in the salt flats, a day that haunted the corridors of his nightmares with a relentless, icy persistence, a memory so vivid he could still smell the coal oil in the ozone. He described the family, the Miller kith, simple dirt farmers who had refused to buy out, believing their deed was a shield against the iron horse. Eli had stood guard at the gate, his Winchester resting easy in the crook of his arm, young and foolish and telling himself he was just doing a job, just enforcing the inevitable law of progress. But then the order came to burn. He recounted the sound of the kerosene splashing against the dry timber of the barn, the way the livestock screamed before the roof collapsed, a sound that was indistinguishable from the cries of the children watching their world turn to ash in the freezing wind. He saw the farmer, a man with hands calloused from honest work just like Eli's were now, beaten to his knees in the snow, blood turning the white drift to crimson, begging not for the land, but for mercy, for a wagon to carry his freezing kin. Eli had done nothing. He had stood there, a statue of complicity, a golem made of obedience and apathy, watching the light of the fire reflect in the eyes of the devastatingly innocent, and in that moment, something inside him had snapped, a tether to his own humanity severed by the sharp edge of his inaction. He told Martha he had ridden away that night, leaving his pay in the dirt, riding until his horse lathered and collapsed, trying to outrun the smell of smoke that seemed to have seeped into his very pores, a scent that no amount of prairie wind could ever scrub away. He had spent every day since trying to wash his hands clean, drifting from ranch to ranch, keeping his head down, burying his guns in the bottom of his pack. But the stain was under the skin, a tattoo of guilt that throbbed every time he saw a train cut across the horizon. He looked at her now, expecting the condemnation she had every right to deliver, expecting her to scream or run or banish him back to the darkness where he belonged. He told her that protecting her wasn't just a good deed, it was the only chance he had left to balance a ledger that was dripping in red. He was terrified, not of the guns that were undoubtedly coming, but of the possibility that he was too far gone to be saved, that his soul was already forfeit to the devil who built the railroad. By standing with her, he was painting a target on his back that every hired killer in the territory would recognize, for there is no hatred deeper than that reserved for a turncoat, for the man who knows the secrets and walks away. He knew the men Greeley would send because he used to drink with them. He knew their tactics, their cruelty, their absolute lack of hesitation. He was a traitor to the powers that ruled this land, and they would come for him with a fury that would make the saloon brawl look like a schoolyard scuffle. The internal conflict toward him, the instinct to survive, to mount up and vanish into the vast anonymity of the West, warring with the desperate, clawing need to atone, to finally stand between the monster and the innocent. He told her he was afraid that his help would only bring the violence to her doorstep faster, that his past was a contagion she couldn't afford to catch. But as he stood there, stripped of his secrets, waiting for her judgment, he realized that the choice had already been made by the ghosts watching from the shadows. He was bound to this rock, to this river, to this woman who had risen from the dead. He would stand between her and the monster he used to serve, even if it meant he had to die to finally sleep without seeing the fire, even if his redemption was nothing more than a bullet meant for someone else. The confession hung in the air, heavy and toxic and undeniably real, waiting to be either forgiven or weaponized, as the first coyotes of the night began to sing their mournful songs to a moon that looked cold, distant, and utterly unforgiving of the sins of men. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. The sun had barely begun to bleed into the western horizon, painting the river in streaks of violent violet and bruised orange, when the silence of the sanctuary was shattered not by the howl of a wolf, but by the ominous, metallic click of a repeater rifle being levered into readiness. Eli Mercer had been waiting for this sound, his muscles coiled tight as fence wire ever since his confession, but when it came, it felt less like an ambush and more like the inevitable closing of a steel trap. Emerging from the tree line like specters manifesting from the deepening shadows rode the law, though there was nothing lawful about the menace radiating from the man at the lead. Marshal Thorne Greeley sat atop a pale stallion that looked too clean for the rugged terrain, his silhouette cutting a sharp, arrogant figure against the fading light. He was the spitting image of his father, Silas, possessing the same predatory jowling and eyes that looked at the world as if it were a ledger to be balanced. But where the father carried the weight of industry, the son carried the insolence of inherited power. Thorne did not draw his weapon immediately. Instead, he reached into his duster and produced a sheaf of papers, the parchment crisp and white, fluttering in the river breeze like the feathers of a dead dove. He spoke with a voice that was smooth, cultivated, and dripping with false civility, announcing that he held a federal writ of eviction for one Martha Colt, cited for vagrancy and trespassing on railroad property, and a warrant for the arrest of Eli Mercer for conspiracy to impede federal infrastructure. The words hung in the air, heavy and bureaucratic, transforming the wild, ancient riverbank into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Eli stood his ground between the marshal and the fire, his hand hovering inches from the worn walnut grip of his peacemaker, his heart hammering a rhythm that matched the thudding of hooves as 6 deputies fanned out into a semicircle, blocking the easy retreat to the open plains. Thorne smiled then, a cold, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes, and tossed the papers onto the ground at Eli's boots, telling him that he could either walk away now and ride back to the obscurity he came from, or he could die protecting a ghost who didn't know the year, let alone the law. It was a test, Eli realized, a precise calculation meant to weigh his guilt against his survival instinct. He looked at the papers, now staining with the river mud, seeing in them the same legal fiction that had justified the burning of the Miller farm, the same ink that had signed the death warrants of the families he had once helped displace. To hand her over was to sign his soul away forever. To refuse was to commit suicide. But as he glanced back at Martha, who stood frozen by the embers of their dying fire, he saw that she was not looking at the guns or the badges. She was looking at the trees, her lips moving in a silent, frantic cadence, reading the landscape like a scripture only she could decipher. Eli turned back to Thorne, his decision hardening in his chest like cooling iron. He kicked the papers into the fire, the sudden flare of consuming flame acting as his only answer. Thorne's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a sneer of genuine hatred. He raised his hand, not to wave goodbye, but to signal the execution, and the riverbank exploded. The first shot cracked through the air like a whip, kicking up a geyser of dirt inches from Eli's boot, sending the horses into a frenzy of rearing panic. Eli didn't wait for the second. He dove, tackling Martha into the depression of the earth behind the fallen cottonwood log just as the air where they had been standing was filled with the angry buzz of lead bees. The deafening roar of gunfire tore the evening apart, shredding the leaves and splintering the bark of the ancient trees that had stood watch over this river for a century. Eli returned fire blindly over the log, the recoil of his Colt slamming into his palm, the muzzle flash blinding him momentarily in the gathering dusk. But he wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting to create chaos, to buy them seconds in a game where minutes cost lives. The gully. Martha screamed, her voice piercing through the ringing in Eli's ears, pointing not away from the river, but parallel to it, toward a dense, impenetrable thicket of bramble and scrub oak that looked impassable. The old smuggler's trace. Go. Eli hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat. It looked like a dead end, a trap where they would be pinned down and slaughtered. But the certainty in her eyes was absolute. She wasn't guessing, she was remembering. He grabbed her arm, hauling her up as bullets chewed the wood around them, and they sprinted into the darkness, the shadows swallowing them whole. The deputies shouted, their voices confused and angry, their shots going wide as they lost their targets in the gloom. Martha moved with a sudden, eerie grace, ducking under low-hanging branches and weaving through the thorns as if the land itself were parting to let her pass. This was the madness she had carried, not a broken mind, but a perfect, crystalline map of a world that had been erased, a geography of survival that the railroad maps didn't show. They slid down a hidden embankment, the mud slick and cold, dropping into a dry creek bed that ran beneath the canopy of the brush, invisible from the ridge above. Above them, they could hear the heavy thud of Thorne's stallion pacing the bank, could hear his voice shouting orders to burn the brush, to flush them out like rats. But they were already moving deeper into the veins of the earth, following a trail that had been used by the Colt family to move cattle during the First Wars, a path that existed only in the memory of the woman the world had thrown away. Eli could hear his own breath tearing at his throat, could feel the burn of a graze on his shoulder he hadn't noticed until now. But as he followed the specter of Martha Colt through the twisting, moonless labyrinth, he realized they weren't just running away. They were disappearing into the history of the land, slipping into the cracks where the railroad couldn't follow, moving toward the ruins that held the truth. The confrontation had been lost, their supplies were gone, and they were hunted animals. But as the sounds of the pursuit faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the dry stones, Eli knew that for the first time in 20 years, the Colts were not just dying, they were maneuvering. The war had begun, and the first battle had been won not by a bullet, but by memory. The moon had risen high enough to cast a pale, spectral light over the valley floor by the time the hidden trail widened, spitting Eli and Martha out into a clearing that felt less like a geographic location and more like an open wound in the earth. They stood at the edge of the Colt homestead, or what remained of it, a sprawling skeleton of timber and stone that had been picked clean by the vultures of time and fire. The silence here was different than the silence of the river. It was heavy, oppressive, a suffocating blanket woven from 20 years of unvoiced screams. Eli dismounted, his boots crunching softly on ground that felt hallowed, and helped Martha down from the saddle of the horse they had managed to lead through the brush. She did not stumble this time. She moved toward the ruins with the terrifying certainty of a sleepwalker returning to her bed, her eyes fixed on the jagged silhouette of the main chimney, which stood alone against the starry sky like a blackened tombstone. As they walked through the remains of the front gate, Eli saw the burned fences, the posts charred down to nubs yet still standing in a defiant line, marking a boundary that no longer existed for cattle, but still held back the encroaching wilderness. The smell of ash seemed to rise from the soil with every step, a phantom scent that the rain and wind of 2 decades had failed to scrub away, filling Eli's nose with the acrid memory of the violence he had confessed to knowing too well. Martha led him through the ghost of the front door, stepping over the rotted threshold into the open-air cavern of the main hall. Weeds grew waist-high through the floorboards, and saplings twisted their way through the ribs of the roof, but Martha walked the floor plan as if the walls were still whole, stepping around furniture that had turned to dust long ago. She stopped at the hearth, the stone cold and covered in lichen, and reached out a trembling hand to trace the rough surface of the mantel. Eli moved closer, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, and saw what she was touching. They were not mystical ruins or warnings, but the simple, heartbreaking graffiti of a family, vertical lines etched into the stone marking the height of children as they grew, initials carved inside lopsided hearts, dates commemorating births and anniversaries. These were the symbols of the sanctuary she had spoken of, the physical proof of love that had been interrupted by gunfire. Martha's fingers lingered on a set of small, jagged marks near the bottom, a child's attempt to write their own name, and the dam that had held back her reality finally broke. It didn't start with a scream, but with a sound much worse, a low, keening whimper that seemed to be torn from the very center of her being. She collapsed, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the memory. She felt her knees in the dirt and ash, curling into herself, her forehead resting against the cold stone where her family had once warmed their hands. Eli stood frozen, watching the crazy Martha of the town dissolve. He realized with a jolting clarity that the woman he had been protecting was never insane. The fragmented speech, the wandering, the paranoia, it wasn't madness, it was grief. It was a grief so vast, so unmanageable, that it had shattered her time, leaving her trapped in the moment of a massacre, forced to relive the ending of her world every single day for 20 years. She began to speak, her voice wet and thick with tears, but she wasn't talking to Eli.
She was apologizing to the empty room. She was begging her father to get down, telling her mother to hide the baby, whispering promises that they would be safe if they just stayed quiet. It was a reenactment of the slaughter, performed by the sole survivor on the stage of her trauma. She clawed at the dirt, as if trying to dig them out, trying to reverse the burial that nature had performed. Eli looked away, unable to bear the intimacy of her pain, and his gaze fell upon the backyard, where 3 mounds of earth rose slightly above the overgrown grass, marked only by rough, uncarved river stones similar to the one she had described earlier. The graves of her kin. They were right there, just beyond the burned porch, silent witnesses to her exile. A rage began to build in Eli's chest, a cold, hard pressure that displaced the fear and the guilt. He looked at the burned fences, at the bullet holes that still pockmarked the standing stones of the chimney, at the woman who had been reduced to a ghost by the greed of men like Silas Greeley and the indifference of men like himself. He realized that justice in this land was not something that was given by judges or written on paper. It was something that had to be built, stone by stone, blood by blood. He walked over to Martha, the sound of his spurs soft in the night, and knelt beside her. He didn't try to hush her or tell her it was going to be all right, because that would be a lie. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, a solid, grounding weight in the midst of her storm. He waited until her sobbing subsided into jagged breaths, until she lifted her head to look at him with eyes that were red and raw but clear. He drew his revolver then, the metal gleaming in the moonlight, and checked the cylinder, spinning it with a sharp, mechanical click that cut through the weeping wind. He holstered it with a deliberate slowness and looked her dead in the eye. He told her that he couldn't bring them back. He couldn't unburn the house or scrub the blood from the soil. But he vowed, by the God that had forgotten this valley and the devil that had claimed it, that he would not let the man who did this sleep in peace another night. He told her that he was done running, done hiding, and done apologizing. He was her wall now. He was the fence that wouldn't burn. He promised her that he would stand between her and the world until the debt was paid.
Until the sanctuary was restored or until they buried him next to her kin. Martha looked at him, and for the first time, the ghost of the girl she used to be flickered behind her eyes, not fearful, but fierce. She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, sealing a pact that was stronger than law and deeper than blood. They sat there in the ruins of the past, 2 broken things forging themselves into a weapon, waiting for the sun to rise on a war that was finally, truly joined. The wind howled through the chimney, sounding less like a mournful cry and more like a battle hymn, as the shadows of the Colt ranch lengthened, preparing to stretch out and strangle the empire that had tried to destroy them. The transformation of the Colt ruins from a graveyard of memories into a bastion of resistance did not happen with the fanfare of trumpets or the galloping of cavalry, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of a tide turning against the shore. It began as a whisper carried on the wind, a rumor passed between the dispossessed and the shanty towns on the edge of the rail yards, shared over meager fires in the hobo camps, and murmured in the back pews of churches where the prayers were always for salvation and never for justice. The word was simple: the sanctuary was real. Eli Mercer had ridden out under the cover of darkness in the days following their escape, not to recruit gunslingers or mercenaries, for he knew that fire could not be fought with fire against a man like Greeley who owned the match factory, but to find the people whose names were written in Martha's leather-bound journal. He found them living in the hollows of the world, the widows of the farmers who had been shot down by the regulators, the children who had grown up in orphanages after their parents were displaced, and the aging veterans of the Civil War who had traded their limbs for a country that had left them to rot. They came not because they were summoned to war, but because they were invited home. By the 3rd day, the horizon was dotted with the silhouettes of the forgotten, a pilgrimage of broken souls moving across the dust-choked plains toward the beacon of the Colt chimney. They arrived in wagons held together by wire and hope, on mules that looked as weary as their riders, and on foot, their boots worn through to the skin. It was a motley, ragged assembly that should have looked pathetic, yet as they crested the ridge and saw Martha standing amidst the charred fence posts, a profound dignity settled over the valley, a sense of purpose that straightened spines bent by years of servitude. These were not soldiers. They were the debris of the empire, the human cost of the railroad's expansion, and they had come to collect the dead. Eli watched from the perimeter, his hand resting on his gun, his eyes scanning the distance for the dust cloud that would herald Thorne Greeley's return. But his attention was constantly drawn back to the camp that was growing within the skeleton of the ranch. It was a scene of biblical resonance, a gathering of the tribes of the unwanted. He saw men who had fought on opposite sides of the war, one wearing a faded, moth-eaten Union kepi and the other a tattered Confederate gray coat, working side by side to clear the rubble from the main hall, their enmity dissolved by the shared reality of hunger and displacement. He saw women whose faces were maps of grief washing clothes in the creek that had once run red with cult blood, their laughter, tentative and rusty, sounding like a miracle in the heavy air. They pitched tents made of canvas scraps and oilcloths, creating a patchwork city that clung to the ruins like ivy, reclaiming the space not with violence, but with a defiant act of living. Martha moved among them, and the transformation in her was nothing short of transfiguration. The frenetic energy of crazy Martha had settled into a calm, matriarchal authority. She no longer clutched the journal to her chest as a shield. She opened it on the flat stone of the hearth, reading the names of the original families, the intended beneficiaries of the land grant, tracing the lineage of the sanctuary that her father had died to build. She spoke to them not of revenge, but of restoration. She told them that this land was federally granted for them, a safe haven carved out of the wilderness before the railroad had bribed the surveyors to erase it. When she spoke, she didn't sound like a victim. She sounded like a prophet who had walked through the fire and returned with the tablets of the law. The people touched the hem of her ragged shawl as she passed, not in worship, but in recognition. She was the vessel of their history, the living proof that they had not been forgotten. However, beneath the scenes of communal renewal, a current of tension ran through the camp, a vibrating wire of anxiety that Eli could feel in his teeth. He knew, and the old veterans knew, that this peace was a fragile interlude before the storm. They were not just squatting on private property, they were challenging the foundational lie of the Greeley Empire. By occupying the land and asserting the validity of the old cult charter, they were threatening to unravel the legal tapestry that allowed the railroad to control the territory. This was an insurrection of the truth. Eli organized the defense not with the strategy of a general, but with the pragmatism of a protector. He gathered the veterans, men who knew the sound of a canister shot and the smell of gangrene, and they established watch rotations, cleaning old muskets and Sharps rifles that hadn't been fired since Appomattox. They didn't have the firepower to hold off a regiment, but they had the terrain, and more importantly, they had the moral high ground. Eli told them that they were not an army of conquest, they were an army of witnesses. If Greeley wanted this land, he would have to massacre 100 innocent people in broad daylight, and he would have to do it while the world was watching. The strategy was a gamble, a high-stakes poker hand played with human lives, relying on the slim hope that even a monster like Silas Greeley feared the judgment of the public eye. As the sun began to set on the fifth day, painting the sky in the bloody hues of the coming conflict, the atmosphere in the camp shifted from industrious to solemn. The cooking fires burned low, and the sound of hymns drifted up from the makeshift tents, a mournful, defiant chorus of Rock of Ages and the battle hymn of the Republic mingling together in the twilight. Eli sat on the porch steps, sharpening his knife, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley floor. He felt a profound sense of isolation even surrounded by so many people, the burden of his past sins weighing heavily on him. He looked at the faces around the fires, the children playing with sticks in the dirt, the widows sharing bread, the old soldiers smoking their pipes, and he saw the very people he had once helped to victimize. He realized that this was his penance. He was raising an army of the people he had wronged to fight the master he had served. It was a circle closing, a noose starting. Martha came and sat beside him, silence shared between them like a loaf of bread. She didn't need to ask if he was afraid. The fear was as tangible as the dust on their clothes. She simply pointed toward the eastern ridge, where the last light of the day was catching the steel rails of the distant train tracks, gleaming like the fangs of a serpent. She told him that they were coming. Eli nodded, sliding the knife back into its sheath. He knew. The quiet growth of this movement had been too loud to ignore. They had embarrassed the power, and power never forgives embarrassment. The Greeley Empire would not tolerate a sanctuary for the things it tried to discard. Tomorrow, the papers would be useless, and the hymns would stop. Tomorrow, the illusion of safety would shatter, and Eli Mercer would have to stand between the army of the forgotten and the machine that wanted to bury them all. The night settled in, cold and watchful, as 1,000 ghosts waited for the dawn. The horizon bled into a crimson dawn, the rising sun appearing not as a gentle source of light but as a colossal, angry eyes staring down at the confrontation on the valley floor. The cold air of the pre-dawn hours was thick with the smell of dust and gun oil, a suffocating mixture of earth and death that promised no mercy. Eli Mercer stood at the head of the assembled company, his back to the ruins of the ranch and the 100 desperate souls huddled behind him. The women stood near the old chimney, clutching their children and the ragged symbols of their former lives, and the veterans, the broken army, lined the charred fence line, their old, heavy rifles resting on the rails, their hands steady with the grim resolve of men who had long ago stopped fearing death and were only afraid of failing one last time. Across the dew-dampened field, silhouetted against the fiery light of the east, sat Marshal Thorne Greeley, who had arrived precisely at first light with the devastating efficiency of a general on the attack. He had traded the arrogance of his first visit for the chilling certainty of command, leading a heavy column of 12 armed deputies, all mounted on fresh horses and carrying gleaming, modern repeater rifles. They were the machine, sleek and functional, facing off against the human detritus of history. Thorne raised his hand, signaling his column to stop 50 yards from the fence line, and the ensuing silence was so vast it swallowed the soft sigh of the wind. Thorne didn't waste time on formalities. He simply bellowed that the time for play acting was over, demanding that Eli Mercer surrender the woman and disperse the rabble immediately, or he would open fire and cleanse the blight from his father's property. His voice was a hammer blow against the stillness, a flat, undeniable statement of power. Eli didn't move, his eyes locked on Thorne's, a cold, hard knot tightening in his own chest. He felt the trembling of the men behind him, the low, anxious whimper of a child, and the silent pressure of the 100 gazes fixed on his back. He was the only thing standing between these people and the 12 Winchesters aimed at them, and he knew his life was worth less than a single bullet to Thorne Greeley. Before Eli could formulate the defiant refusal that would undoubtedly start the massacre, a movement from behind him seized the attention of every man on the field. Martha stepped forward, her movement slow and deliberate, weaving past Eli and walking into the no-man's land with a gait that was no longer that of a homeless woman, but of a queen demanding fealty. She was unarmed, wearing the same collection of tattered clothing, but in the rising sun, the gray of her hair looked like a crown of silver. She reached the center of the field, the very point where the grass was still flattened from their first standoff, and stopped, turning to face Thorne Greeley with the sun blazing behind her, an incandescent figure of defiance. Thorne was visibly jarred, his jaw tightening as he looked at the woman he was supposed to dismiss as a tramp, now standing like a monument on his property. He shouted at her to stop, to get down on her knees, threatening to shoot her for resisting a federal marshal. But Martha ignored him completely. She reached into the lining of her shawl, pulling out not a gun, but the object she had carried through 20 years of exile, the leather-bound journal. She didn't open it. Instead, she pulled from between the pages a folded, brittle sheet of paper, yellowed with age, its edges frayed like old lace. She unfolded it slowly, the cracking sound of the antique paper audible in the terrifying silence, and held it up to the sun, a single, delicate square of parchment against the vastness of the armed confrontation. In a voice that was no longer a whisper of grief but a ringing, authoritative command that carried across the field, Martha began to read, not from a Bible or a poem, but from the official language of government law. She read the date, the signature of the president, and the precise, unalterable boundaries of the land grant, proving that the Colt family had been federally deeded the sanctuary for the express purpose of establishing a sanctuary for the nation's discarded. She read the clause that stipulated the land could never be seized for commercial use, a legal shield her father had foresightedly purchased with the lives of his family. Her reading was an act of quiet, devastating violence, tearing away the decades of lies that had propped up the Greeley empire. The effect on the deputies was immediate. They shifted in their saddles, their eyes flickering from the paper to their marshal, the authority of the badge suddenly wrestling with the crushing weight of the law being read aloud. Thorne Greeley, however, was past the point of legal debate, his face contorted into a mask of pure, murderous panic as he realized his father's entire legacy was about to be obliterated by a scrap of paper. He spurred his horse forward, yelling that the document was a forgery, that she was under arrest, his hand flashing toward the butt of his pistol, intent on silencing the truth forever. As he lunged, moving to crush the unarmed woman with the weight of his horse. Eli Mercer's hand was a blur, his gun already clearing the leather. But the shot that rang out was not his. The single, sharp crack came from the fence line, tearing through the tension and stopping Thorne's charge cold. Eli, turning in shocked confusion, saw the rifle smoke drifting from the muzzle of a very old, very long Sharps rifle held by a figure in a dusty Union coat, a former ally of Martha's, one of the aging veterans who had fought for the Union only to be abandoned by it. The veteran had not aimed at Thorne, he had shot the marshal's horse. The powerful stallion screamed, its legs buckling under it, throwing Thorne Greeley violently into the dirt, the impact of his heavy body sending his own pistol skittering uselessly toward Eli's feet. The sudden, chaotic act broke the symmetry of the standoff. The deputies froze, their fingers twitching over their triggers, their focus split between their fallen leader and the 100 targets now exposed at the fence line. The air thrummed with the unbearable agony of choice. One wrong move, one tremor of a finger, and the valley would become a slaughterhouse. Eli looked from the fallen marshal, stunned and scrambling in the dirt, to the fierce, unmoving figure of Martha, still holding the deed high like a flag, and he knew that the final violence was teetering on a razor's edge. The blood had started to flow, but the war for the soul of the valley was still undecided. The gunshot that dropped Thorne Greeley's horse was not the end of the war, but the sudden, violent pivot around which everything turned, transforming the standoff from a massacre in waiting into a moment of unbearable, agonizing political theater. As Thorne lay stunned in the dirt, struggling to retrieve his weapon while the deputies held their fire, shocked by the audacity of the single, defiant shot, Eli Mercer moved with the cold, clear focus of a man who had finally earned his redemption. He did not draw on the fallen marshal, but rather used the moment of chaotic hesitation to advance, sweeping up Thorne's skittering pistol and kicking it out of reach. Martha remained standing, her posture as rigid and commanding as the cult chimney behind her, holding the federal deed aloft, making herself a monument to the truth. She did not need to speak further. The paper, and the sudden realization among the deputies that they were about to slaughter 100 unarmed, legally justified settlers at the command of a man who had just been proven a liar, carried more weight than a dozen repeating rifles. Eli looked at the deputies, his own gun leveled not at them, but at the ground between them, his voice low and carrying the weight of his own dark history. He told them they knew the law, and he told them they knew the difference between a land thief and a deed of federal grant. The hesitation in the land broke, not in violence, but in resignation. One by one, the deputies lowered their rifles, the metallic clatter of the levers sounding like the chimes of a final judgment. Thorne Greeley was on his feet now, screaming obscenities about treason and forgery, scrambling toward his fallen gun. But it was too late. Two of his own men, former farm boys who had signed up for the badge, not for the corruption, moved quickly, seizing him and twisting his arms behind his back, securing the cuffs with a definitive snap that echoed across the field, the sound of an empire buckling under the weight of its own avarice. The arrest of Silas Greeley's son, the marshal, on the Colt land, by his own men, was the closing scene of the massacre, ensuring that the theft would finally be reversed. Within the year, the wheels of justice, though slow and heavy with the inertia of established power, were turned by the indisputable evidence of Martha's document in the public, documented shame of Thorne Greeley's apprehension. The land was formally restored, and Martha Colt, no longer crazy Martha but the undisputed matriarch of the valley, did exactly what her father had dreamed. The ruins were cleared, not by contractors, but by the communal labor of the resurrected community, and the first stones were laid for the sanctuary. It rose from the ashes not as a grand palace, but as a practical, sturdy collection of simple buildings, a hospice for aging veterans whose bodies were riddled with the steel of lost wars, a small schoolhouse filled with the laughter of children who had known only the inside of overcrowded city orphanages, and a long, communal dining hall where war widows could share a warm meal in the silent acknowledgement of shared loss. It was a haven built by the forgotten, for the forgotten, a physical manifestation of redemption carved out of the wilderness. Eli Mercer stayed for the building, his hands expert with the hammer and the axe, his silence a comfort to the others. He built the fence lines that would never burn, crafted the sturdy doors that would never be kicked in, and repaired the hearth where Martha had first broken down, ensuring the stones were solid and clean. He was a silent, indispensable protector, but his work was penance, and penance has an ending. On a morning 1 year later, before the sun had fully risen, painting the eastern sky in soft hues of silver and rose, Eli saddled his horse and quietly rode away. He didn't tell anyone he was leaving. He rode past the communal hall where the light was just beginning to glow from within, past the schoolhouse where a young widow was already lighting the stove, and past the garden where the old veteran, the one who had shot the horse, was tending the rose with meticulous care. He knew his presence, a reminder of the violence and the dark origins of the conflict, was no longer necessary, and perhaps no longer beneficial. He owed them a sanctuary, and he had delivered it. His own sanctuary lay somewhere else, in the anonymity of the open road, in the pursuit of a peace that was not collective but solitary. He reached the ridge and stopped, looking back at the valley. The Colt ranch was gone, replaced by the rising, hopeful shape of the sanctuary, a promise kept to the dead and a home provided to the living. Martha Colt stood alone at the center of the field, near the restored chimney, watching him go. She looked taller, straighter, her clothes still simple but now clean, her silhouette framed by the new dawn. She was no longer the desperate ghost of the past, but the matriarch of the future, standing firm in the light of new beginnings. Eli touched the brim of his hat in a silent farewell and turned his horse west, disappearing into the vast, indifferent country. But as the narrator observes the trail of dust left behind in the sanctuary rising on the plain, the final, haunting question hangs heavy in the fading dawn. Forgiveness, Elijah had sought and perhaps found. But did that forgiveness truly heal the history of the land, the scars of the massacre, the systematic violence of empire? Or was it simply the most beautiful, comforting way to finally bury the bodies and silence the screams, allowing the world to move on, forgetting the price of the progress written in blood? The answer, the narrator suggests, lies not in the silence Eli rode into, but in the echoes that would inevitably return to haunt the beautiful, fragile peace of the sanctuary, reminding all who live there that history is rarely healed. It is simply managed, until the next storm rolls in. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.